Hello, and welcome to the fourth and final webinar of the Open Lab series. This one we will be going over Heimdall. Before we get started, we're going to go over a little bit of housekeeping. So if you have any questions during this webinar, please submit questions to the GoToWebinar console. Questions will be answered at the end, and slides and recordings will be shared after the webinar. My name is Jamie Thorson. I'm the Manager of Implementation Engineering, and I will be the one going over Heimdall today. So the agenda for this webinar is first we're going to go over what is Heimdall, how do I get started, using Heimdall in your product, and why to or not to use Heimdall. Okay, so first of all, what is Heimdall? Heimdall is an authentication as a service tool that is built by Cloud Elements, but not as part of our product, just as part of our Open Labs that people can use within their own products. It's intended to simplify the authentication by allowing you to configure your application on Heimdall, embed a small amount of JavaScript in your front end, and potentially a line of code in your back end. And then this will enable authentication and instance creation to Cloud Elements, to any element within your Cloud Elements account for your application. So getting started with Heimdall. First of all, where do you find Heimdall in Open Labs? Heimdall is located in the Open Labs organization under its own repo called Heimdall. In other webinar series, we talked about cloning the repo or forking and cloning the repo. So I added this, do I need to clone the repo? And not necessarily. So Heimdall can be run locally, in which case you might want to clone the repo. Or if you're going to host it yourself on your private servers, then you would want to have a clone of the repo that you can manipulate and use in your own servers. But if you are just using Heimdall, you don't necessarily need to clone the repo, and I'll go over this later, but Heimdall has its own environments which can be used without cloning the repo. And then what is required to get started? It is required that you have a Cloud Elements account that corresponds to the respective staging or production Heimdall you plan to use. And this Cloud Elements account is required because Heimdall looks at your user and organization tokens to identify how your account in Cloud Elements associates with your Heimdall account. So Heimdall environment. As I mentioned, Heimdall is available to all in a staging environment that's hosted by Cloud Elements. There's also a production environment hosted by Cloud Elements. And this production environment, you are welcome to use, but if you're going to use this, please contact your Cloud Elements delivery manager or technical account manager to discuss hosting fees. And then otherwise, Heimdall can be hosted locally, which is, I'll go over a little bit in more detail later, but is also in the repo on how to do that. Or you can host it on your private servers, and this can be done both for testing and production as needed. So configuring a Heimdall application. As I mentioned, Heimdall is associated with your Cloud Elements user and organization secrets. So this means you can't have more than one Heimdall application per Cloud Elements organization. To get started associating a Heimdall application with your Cloud Elements account, there's a pretty simple curl you can run. And so I put this in here, and I'm going to do a start-to-end demo a little later on, so I'll actually be using this and showing you how this works in action. But just to go over the basic concept, this is a curl request. And what this is doing, in this particular case, this is the production Heimdall. So this heimdall.cloudelements.com is the production one. And I'll go over where you can find the staging and the production ones respectively. So if you were testing this, you might start with the staging one, but it's the same idea. You do a post to the URL to post the application. In this application, you use your user and organization secrets, and that's how it creates your Heimdall application. And then you want to make sure to have this notification email and CSS URL if needed. So to go over that a little bit, the notification email doesn't have to match the email that is on your Cloud Elements account. It just has to be an email that Heimdall will use to send emails to when an instance is created. So if you have an email that you're using that isn't necessarily part of your Cloud Elements account, but is the email you want to get notifications to, you can use that email, and it won't be a problem if it doesn't match your user and org secret, the email associated with those. And then the CSS URL, you don't have to include. This is for overriding the CSS for the generated form. So Heimdall comes with a pretty low level of CSS. It's very basic, not, basic gray boxes for authentication. And then if you wanted to override this, you could add a CSS URL that overrides the existing CSS. And then you would insert that here when you create your Heimdall application. So once the app is configured, so after you run that curl command, you now have a Heimdall application, but there's nothing workable or usable yet. So oftentimes people think by running this, they now have Heimdall and they can authenticate any elements, and that's not quite the case. You now have a Heimdall application associated with your Cloud Elements account, but then you next need to figure out what elements you want to put into your Heimdall application. So once you've identified the elements you'll be working with, you have to set up the elements on Heimdall. So to set up the elements on Heimdall, you have to configure them, and this can be done by getting an element by its key within Cloud Elements, and they have the configuration variables. You can see which ones are required there, so you know which ones you need to include. But I'll kind of go over this, what to expect and how to find some examples. So this also has a curl command where you're posting elements in Heimdall. So again, you don't have element instances yet. You're just posting the elements themselves to be able to work with your Heimdall application. So this is the curl to post the elements. And what this does, you'll want this URL to match the same one you used in the application setup. So this one is, again, the production Heimdall, but you could replace this with the staging Heimdall or where you're hosting your Heimdall. And then you have to have, authorization, user organization authorizations. These are just made up ones for examples. And then you would insert the actual configuration for that element. And so I'm just going to hop over real quick to the OpenLabs repo. So this is the OpenLabs repo, the Heimdall repo within our OpenLabs organization. And in here, you can see some example configurations. So this is that same curl request, but this one has data in it. So this is the example for box. And in here, you'll see these properties. And these properties are associated with the element configurations that are required specifically for box. So in here, you can see that OAuth API key is required, and you would enter some default value for that. And then you would want to put whether they're required in Heimdall as well. So in this case, you wouldn't display that API key in Heimdall because you don't want to expose your API key to the users that you're having authenticate through Heimdall. So this display says false. So then in your Heimdall application, it's not going to display the API key and secret, but you would add your API key and secret that your users are authenticating against in here. If there was a case, like desk has a property, I believe. No, let's try, yeah, here's desk. So in here, desk has one subdomain. So in this case, the subdomain is going to change from user to user. So Heimdall will need to display this as a text box in which the users can fill this out. So you can, in which case you also want to make sure the data type is, in this case, text. So you're going to want to make sure that data type is accurate and that that display value is set to what you want for that element in your Heimdall application. Once you have that, this can all go into the data in that curl. So this whole thing would be taken back to the curl command that's here and would be put in this insert data. So then that's added there, and then you can post that. Now that element is part of your Heimdall application, but again, you don't have instances of that element. It's just available to make instances of. So I jumped ahead and looked at those examples, but we do have a handful of those examples in that repo. So I for sure showed you that there was Box and Desk. There's also HubSpot, BigCommerce, and a few others. And then if you need to do one that's not an example there, again, if you get the element by its key or ID, you can see the configuration that's needed to configure an instance of that element. And those same fields that are in our element configuration on Cloud Elements would need to be configured on your Heimdall application. So now, posting an element instance in Heimdall. Now that Heimdall is configured and has elements to work with, you're able to jump in and get started with adding it to your application so that your users can post instances of it. There are two methods to add this to your application, and one of them is more secure. Both of these are outlined in the repo. So if you're planning to add this, you're going to want to read through the repo and find out which is best for your use case. But I'll kind of jump into those and go over when you could use the less secure and still have it be secure versus all other use cases, in which case you should use the more secure. But before I do that, I'm just going to get through a few more slides, and then we'll actually go jump in and try this out. So why would you use Heimdall? Well, it takes time to configure applications correctly in Heimdall and make sure that you have those elements set up on your Heimdall application. We've found that it often takes much less time than configuring code to handle the various authentication types. Basic, OAuth 1, OAuth 2, and custom are all authentication types that Cloud Elements supports. And then within these, sometimes there's unique differences that each one might require. So we looked at Desk that had subdomain, but not all elements. Desk is otherwise, I believe, OAuth 1, but not all OAuth 1 will require the same fields. So in addition to having these 4 authentication types, there's still unique differences within each authentication. So some users have found that it takes less time for them to configure Heimdall applications than to go through and set up the various needs for all of these application types. And so this would be a use case in which if they knew they were adding a lot of different elements that all had different authentication types, it could speed up their process. It also has built-in handling for the redirects for the token exchange and OAuth 2 flows, which a lot of people who are new to APIs find challenging. So this is another way to speed up getting their application built and their authentication ready to go. In the event that your application handles various types of authentication types, then Heimdall is probably not for you. If you can handle it on your side and your code is built to do that, or you have the developer and bandwidth to add that without additional work, then Heimdall might not be necessary because you already can do that. And whenever you can do it in your own application, you have a little bit more control over how it runs. So that is always the recommended way. Heimdall is just a way, if you don't have that, if you don't have the resources or bandwidth to help you get started or to speed up the process for you. If you also are building it out and you don't have this, but you have bandwidth to build it out, you can start with Heimdall as a starting place and then manipulate it how you want for your application. So there's various ways to use it. You don't have to host it as is. You can always then clone the repo and make the changes you need for Heimdall to fit your application needs. Okay, so now we can jump into the start to finish demo. This is kind of the exciting part. So I'm going to start with just walking you through the Heimdall repo, and a lot of this will be repeats from what I just said, just another way to look at it. And then I will go ahead and run through and actually set it up. So, excuse me. So in Heimdall, this is a Heimdall repo. So in Heimdall, we have this table of contents to kind of get you started. And in here, you'll see that it has configuring your application, configuring your elements, usage, and local installation. And so this is basically what I covered, but without much description. Sometimes people find it confusing to what these actually do or what that means. So now that we've covered it, it should be a little bit more clear. If you're configuring your application, again, it has a sample curl request that you would use, and the example elements. And then if you scroll down a little ways, it does go through the less secure and more secure methods. And so I want to touch on this because it is definitely important, since security is obviously the forefront of API integrations, and something that as an API integration company, we really want to emphasize that security is important. And so the less secure method should only be used if your user is signed into your application and the signed in user has their own Cloud Elements user, so they have their own org and user secrets. So that if these are exposed on the front end of the application, the only ones they'll see are their own. If they would see your user and org secret, that would be a security violation. So if they're authenticating and it's your Cloud Elements account and all your users just make instances in your Cloud Elements account, you wouldn't want to use the less secure method, because the users might be able to see that on the front, that could be exposed on the front end. If they had their own Cloud Elements account, it doesn't matter if they see their own credentials. So that would be okay in that use case. And if that was the use case and that fit the needs, then you could add this script to the front end of your application, and it would put Heimdall into your application, so that all you had to do was create that Heimdall application, add the elements, and then this script would allow your users to make instances. Method 2, which is a little bit more secure, actually makes that call from the server-side API call. So it's a little bit extra code, as you can see, but overall, it's not much more code, and this prevents it from having that user secret exposed on the server side, or exposed on the front-end side, so that if users are making instances in your Cloud Elements account, they won't see any of your secrets, and thus eliminating that security violation, potential security violation. So this is the more secure method. This is the one that we would recommend for majority of use cases, unless you fit these two very specific, both, not one or the other. You have to fit both of those two very specific contexts. Okay, so now that we've kind of gone over the security, this also will go through if you need to update instances, and then this is the local installation. So if you wanted to run Heimdall locally, you would have to clone this repo and then follow these steps. I'm not going to go through that because I would rather dive into the actual use of Heimdall instead of running the Heimdall application. The one other thing I said that I would go over that I'm just going to touch on right here is that here at the top you can see these two environments. So there is a staging and production environment. And for this demo, I will use staging because that is the one that you should use for testing. So this is the staging environment. And so all of these curls that you see in examples up to the .com, you would replace with this up to the works, and then all the path variables are the same in the curls. Okay, so now that we've gone over that, I will jump over here. So I just pulled these curls directly from the slides so we can walk through the use cases one at a time. So on slide 8, I gave you the curl to create the Heimdall application. I've already created mine. So before I get started, I do want to touch just very quickly on, in speaking about security. For the purpose of this webinar, I made a Cloud Elements account that has no data in it. So some of these curl commands do expose user and org secrets, and in this case, unlike other examples, these are real user and org secrets because I'm actually going to be walking through the demo, but we still don't recommend that you ever expose user or org secrets. So while I'm demoing it here, this account has nothing in it and will be deleted after this webinar. So you will see that, but please don't expose your user and org secrets because those should not be shown publicly. Okay, so here is the call, and I've already done this call. So I'll also just do it again, just so you can see it, but it'll give an error because I already have an application configured. So in my application, the only thing I didn't include was that CSS, which would be used to override the existing CSS. And I did this for two reasons. One is I actually don't have any CSS I want to override with. And two, this way you can see the default CSS that is built into Heimdall. So this is the curl if you are posting a new application, and this is to staging. So when I run this, like I said, I'm going to get an error that says that it's a validation error because I already have used my user and org secret to create an account associated with Heimdall. But if I run the same command, but I do a get instead of a post, and I don't include that data at the end because it should already have my notification email and whatnot, I can run the same thing, and you'll see that I actually get my application back. So you can see what you have associated, and you can also then, if you want to, run a put call to change this. Oops, hang on, I didn't change it to a get. So let me put get. Okay, so you'll see the response. And so if I had needed to then add a CSS URL later, I can always do a put call and add that CSS URL. So right now it's null. But you can see that this exists. It has an ID. You can see when it was last updated. You can see that it's associated with my email. And so now that I have this application, as I said before, you have an application and there's really nothing in it. So if I wanted to check if I had elements, I could do that. So here I had given you a post call to add elements, but you can also do the corresponding get call to see if you have elements already configured. So I will run this as a get call, again with the same thing, but without the data at the end and with a get instead of a post. So here I'm going to go ahead and run a get call, and I can see if I have any elements associated with this. And I got an empty array back. So I don't have any elements configured, which is a great opportunity for me to start configuring elements. So for this demo, I'm going to start with configuring just one of the ones from the examples. So I'll use box, and I already pulled out that data just from the Heimdall repo, and then the only thing I did was add in my user and org secrets. And I can just grab that whole curl and add it. And so when I add this, I now have box configured as an element in my Heimdall that people can authenticate to. Again, it's not set up in a way that I have any instances. It's just now available. So if I ran the same get call I ran before to see what elements I have available, I now can see I have box available. So I have a Heimdall setup, a Heimdall demo setup, which is a pretty simple application, and I'm just going to show you over here in this handler. I've added this code right here, which is the exact code from the Heimdall repo to create the instance. The only difference is in the repo, it actually puts a fake token right here, whereas I'm actually just getting the response token from the OAuth flow. So this is a pretty simple, very basic demo. I don't have anything going on. So if you were doing this in a real environment, maybe you would have first the landing screen where it would say like authenticate with box, and then when you clicked that, it would take you here. But this is literally going to take you to a place that you're going to just start authenticating with box. Well, with whatever element key you put here. So in this case, I'm going to put box. And then in the event that you were doing this with more than one element, you could also make this dynamic in the same way that I was able to get the elements call in this last screen just by running this request to get the elements. I could dynamically go through and create all of the various Heimdall elements to be available in my application. In this case, like I just showed, I just hard-coded box in, but it doesn't have to be that way. And then I just put a name. So this will be the name that is used for my element. We recommend that it's unique because if you name all your element instances the same name, it gets confusing whose is associated with what. But you know, it's kind of your choice. So if I have this, I'm going to actually deploy this to a serverless server through AWS, and then that'll be running this Heimdall demo. But this Heimdall demo still hits the staging Heimdall environment. So Heimdall itself is running, and I'm hitting the staging environment. But this demo this code that I have right here, I'm going to be running on serverless. So here in my demo, I'm just going to do a serverless deploy. And what this will do is deploy that code I just showed you and give me a URL I can hit to run it. And then I can show you how it actually works to authenticate an instance. So this will just take a minute while it packages everything up and actually deploys it. Okay, so now it's deployed and it gave me this endpoint that I can go to. So in a tab over here, I'm going to open this up and it'll first say working and then, actually let me keep this, and then it'll pop open a new screen where it is taking me to go through the OAuth flow. So right here now I'm able to log in and authorize, and because I used then my Heimdall application, it will ask me if Heimdall can access these things in my Box account, and then if I grant access, it'll go back through and it'll come back to this screen with the instance information. So now that's created. And the thing about this, just to note, is that here I just printed out the instance data, but this is where you would actually then go and add some handling for that. So maybe you want to save it in your database a certain way or whatever you want to do. This is then is authenticated, which is Heimdall's tool, and then you have to figure out the rest of how you want to handle it and what you're doing with it next. But this is just to show that the instance was created, and then if I come back over here to my staging environment and I refresh, you can see that, and like I showed you before, this is a totally empty account that I'm just going to delete afterwards. But now if I come over, you see that I have a Box instance, and it is that instance that I just created. It's my new instance. If you look at the ID, it's the same ID that was posted to this page. So that was just created through that Heimdall demo. And I'm going to show you one other example that uses, so that one didn't display any display fields in Heimdall, so I'll show you one other that does. So if I hop back over to my Heimdall demo, I grabbed a few others, but I'll just grab this one. So this is BigCommerce, and I'm now going to add that to my application as well. So I'm posting this as another element. So now I have two elements available that people can authenticate against. I have BigCommerce or I have Box. So again, if I get my elements, I'll now see that I have the BigCommerce one and the Box one available as applications that my users can authenticate against. So again, in this case, I am going to head back over to my handler. And instead of having Box here, I'm going to do the BigCommerce. And this is the element key. So in this case, it's the same as the element name, but sometimes they're slightly different. So just keep track of that. And then I will redeploy this with that new code. And we'll go through it again. And then what you'll be able to see when this loads is that if your users have to add text fields, so BigCommerce, I believe, is basic authentication. So there's a lot of text fields they have to fill in, and those text fields are dynamically populated in Heimdall, which again saves you a lot of time for having to do that code in your backend or in your front end for how to handle it in your backend, and then also how to populate those fields in your front end, creating the UI that corresponds. So I'm just going to come back here. I'm going to throw that in there, and then this will load, and then again it pops up in another screen, and then this is where you'd fill in that username, the API path, and the token. The API path, we had that default value, so it came through, and then all I'd have to fill in is this part, whereas the other ones just came in totally blank because there was no default value when I configured the Heimdall application. And so just to show you what that looked like here, if we go down to the BigCommerce example, you can see the username had the display true, but it didn't have a default, whereas the API path had the display true, but it had that default value. So that's why they showed up a little bit different. And that's how you can kind of configure it to meet the needs of your application, is through these properties. So when you post those to be available in your Heimdall application, you have some configurability over this, but it also sort of has to match what Cloud Elements expects in terms of what's coming back to Cloud Elements. Otherwise, you'll run into some issues creating the instances. So if I wanted to at this point, I could continue to go through this authentication flow, and it would do a similar thing to the other one, where then it would go through the authentication process and then print the instance in that Heimdall demo. I'm not going to go through all that, but then it would be the same thing where that element would show up here. So then the only other things to go over, so that's the basic flow that you would expect for Heimdall, where you would create the application, add any elements that you need for that application in Heimdall, and then add that to your application, to your internal application, so that Heimdall now is associated with your internal application and can create the instances on your behalf. The only other thing is that you can go through and check what instances you have available. So there are things that you want to make sure are the case. Like you wouldn't want two elements with the same key. So if I was doing this get elements and I ran it and I noticed I had two that were boxed, there's no way of identifying which one you're using, so you would want to delete one. So it's important to note that even though you can get here, you can also do a delete, and then you would just have to add the ID after the elements. So a lot of the same RESTful principles that are applied throughout our application are also available in Heimdall. So even though a lot of the examples just show how to post, you can also do puts and you can also do deletes, and in a similar way that you would in all areas of our platform. So this really allows you to have flexibility over how you use Heimdall. Okay, hopping back over here. Oops, sorry. So that is the end-to-end demo of how you would embed that in an application. Again, that was just a demo application, so it was bare bones. In your application, you could override the CSS so it met your needs more, and you would probably have a landing page where various elements popped up, and then when you clicked them, they went to the screen that I just showed you where it starts the authentication process. So the question is, does Heimdall work with any element? And yes, Heimdall works with any element available in your Cloud Elements account. So whatever account I'm associating with my Cloud Elements account, Heimdall will have access to those elements. This includes element builder elements or elements that you get from the Open Labs element repo, which we discussed in another webinar. So if you grab one of those elements from the elements repo in Open Labs, you could put that in your account, and then Heimdall would be able to work with it. Okay, so that's all that I have. Are there any questions?
Yeah, we have a couple, and I believe you covered this, but why would you not want to use Heimdall?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Heimdall has its own set of error handling and its own flows. If you were able to either take the time to go through and manipulate this to be the way that you want, it might work. But if it's easier for your product to just add this yourself, so if you have enough resources and you have the background knowledge about APIs, then it is recommended that you add authentication into your own application so you can handle it how you want, you can handle errors how you want, and you can kind of have a little bit more control over that. But it still can be used in that case if you want to just use it and then manipulate it for your needs. But that would be a case in which maybe you choose not to use it.
Okay. Do you have a lot of customers using Heimdall?
Well, I don't know I would say a lot. We have a handful, maybe a little more than a handful, but it's also not always clear because it is open source. People could go use it and just host it themselves without us knowing. So we mostly only know of the ones who either ask us to host it for them or ask for help with it.
Are there any types of authentication that are harder to work with in Heimdall?
Not in my opinion. I think that the first one that you build out is usually maybe a little bit harder because you're getting used to the Heimdall flow. And then if you're using one that isn't in the examples one, you're actually having to figure out what do I need to expose and have my users fill out to make it work. And that can be a little bit tricky the first time you do it. So, and it doesn't matter whether it's OAuth 1 or not, or OAuth 2 or basic. It doesn't really matter what that is. It's just that getting familiar with how to configure the element properties when you post them to Heimdall. Once you're familiar with that, I think it just generally gets easier and easier.
And do you have to have a robust UI to support Heimdall?
No, I mean, I just showed you the very bare bones of an application that would run Heimdall and create instances. I wouldn't recommend exposing that to users as a actual process, but you could add, it wouldn't take long to add very little UI to that to make it usable.
And no more questions.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming. This does conclude the webinar series.
Oh, apologies. We had one last minute question come in. It says, can you have multiple Heimdall instances for one Cloud Elements account, or is it one-to-one?
So currently it's one-to-one. We've talked about changing it or finding a way to change that, but currently your Heimdall application, it's one Heimdall application for one Cloud Elements account because it's associated with a user and org secret, and you can't have more than one user and org secret per account. There's not really a way right now how it's built to have more than one. Okay, yeah, so thank you again. I appreciate the questions and the involvement. This is the last of the Open Labs series. I hope that you'll still continue to check out the Open Labs repo, and I look forward to hearing from you guys soon. Bye.